Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's time to get into doing game optimization videos again. We've been getting a ton of requests from you guys to bring back this series. A lot of you said the guides have been really helpful. So starting today with Gears 5, we should be pumping out many more of these as we go through the major releases of 2019. For those that haven't seen one of our optimization videos before, the basic goal here is to go through the various setting options available on PC to determine which way is the best way to play the game. We look at the performance of individual settings, explore the visual quality differences, and at the end give some recommendations as to optimal settings you can use. Gears 5 is a super interesting title on PC for a number of reasons. Developed by the Coalition and published by Xbox Game Studios, which were formerly Microsoft Studios, this is a Microsoft exclusive title designed to run on both Xbox and PC. We've seen from previous Xbox Game Studios titles like Forza Horizon 4 that Microsoft are all in on PC optimization. They don't make these games run like crap. They include all the standard features the PC community expects. They love including lots of graphics options, and they love also pushing the boundaries with cool technology. There is no doubting whatsoever that Gears 5 is a beautiful game that is well optimized. It's not going to push over 100 FPS on mid-range hardware like Forza Horizon 4, but given the excellent presentation, it runs really well at 1440p on something like the RX 5700 XT. It's also one of few PC games to dabble seriously in dynamic resolution scaling, which we'll talk about in depth a bit later. Before we get into the testing here, a couple of our standard notes. All the performance data was captured using my Core i9 9900K test rig with 16GB of DDR4 and a range of GPUs from both NVIDIA and AMD, both entry-level and high-end, averaged into a neat package and taken from the benchmark tool. To simplify everything, we've kept the game as GPU bound as possible. Obviously, we understand that not everyone will be gaming on a 9900K, but these results will be reflective of GPU limited performance, such as an RX 570 paired with a Ryzen 5 2600 at 1080p, for example. As usual, I'll also point out where lower end cards struggle a bit more than higher end variants with some of the graphics options. Most of the footage used throughout this video was captured at 4K on the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2080 Super, although there's a bit of RX 5700 XT and RX 570 footage thrown in as well. We highly recommend watching the video at YouTube's 4K quality to make it easier to spot the differences, or of course you can download a source quality file from our Patreon page, which gives you even better detail and cuts out YouTube's compression. So the first thing I want to talk about are the dynamic resolution options. With traditional PC games, normally you'd set the game to render at your native resolution and play around with the graphics options to get it running at your desired frame rate. But anytime you get to an intensive section or your GPU isn't powerful enough, your frame rate will dip and that can affect the experience. You might have to turn down a few settings to get it running smoothly again. Now, some modern and well-developed titles like Gears 5 can take this setup to the next level. Rather than allowing your frame rate to dip in intensive sections, dynamic resolution scaling lets the resolution dip, which is much harder to notice than a performance drop. Consoles have been doing this for a while to maintain their often pretty conservative performance targets of 30 FPS, but a few newer titles like Gears 5 are bringing this to PC. An example would be that you're playing the game at 4K and maintaining around 60 FPS, but suddenly you approach a group of enemies which is going to hurt performance. Well, rather than dropping down to say 45 FPS, the game modifies the resolution on the fly and renders at an 80% resolution scale briefly while maintaining 60 FPS throughout. The image gets a little softer for a moment, but because you're fighting enemies you don't notice because the performance is still a rock solid 60 FPS. The way this works in Gears 5 is through a number of controls. Firstly, we have the window resolution scale. This sets the target resolution, with 100% of course being native resolution. Then below that we have the minimum frame rate, which is the key control for dynamic resolution scaling. You can set this to 30, 60 or 90 FPS. If the game is going to drop below the frame rate minimum you set, instead it will begin scaling down the resolution to keep up. Alongside that, you'll see controls for maximum frame rate and separate controls that deal with the in-game cinematics. You can see the results of this here in a side-by-side. On the left, we have the native 4K image without dynamic resolution, and throughout the benchmark pass, it runs at 35 to 45 FPS. On the right is the 4K presentation with dynamic resolution, maintaining 60 FPS while dropping the resolution. For the RX 5700 XT, which you're seeing here, the difference amounts to a 40 FPS average without dynamic resolution scaling, or the game dropping to as low as a 70% render resolution or thereabouts while maintaining 60 FPS. In terms of image quality, the differences are quite hard to spot. In this opening section of the benchmark run, which runs as low as 35 FPS on the RX 5700 XT at 4K, the dynamic resolution is also at its lowest. Yes, the dynamic presentation is a bit softer and has less detail when you flick between the two results, but I'd take this result given the gulf in performance. It's actually very impressive to see 35 FPS taken right up to 60 FPS with only a small loss in detail. And on top of that, you can use the game's sharpness slider to improve the image a bit further. While the default is set to around 6, for this run I found a sharpness setting around 20 to deliver an image that's not quite as good as native, but really close. Especially at 4K, I've been a fan of downsampling the resolution to increase performance, plus a light sharpening filter to maintain visuals. Dynamic resolution is the next level version of this, and Gears 5 does a great job with it. As always, there are some limitations to dynamic resolution. The first is that in some configurations I did experience light stuttering. Not with every GPU I tested, but certainly with some, and especially when you're asking dynamic resolution to do a lot of work. If you only occasionally dip below the minimum frame rate set, you'll be fine. It also won't be lowering your resolution forever to maintain performance. With an RX 570 at 1440p, for example, the GPU struggles to maintain even 30 FPS during the opening section of the benchmark. Rather than tanking the resolution to hit the 60 FPS minimum I set, it downsamples the resolution to as low as around 63%, but lets the game run below the minimum limit. So in this case, rather than getting 30 FPS at native resolution, I was hitting around 45 to 50 FPS with a downscaled resolution. In this situation, it could be better to reduce the overall visual quality rather than getting dynamic resolution to do so much work. And as I've mentioned in the past, resolution downsampling becomes less effective the lower your base resolution is. 1440p at a 70% resolution scale is a lot blurrier than 4K at a 70% resolution scale because there are less samples to work with. Sharpening also becomes less effective. So if you're a 1440p or especially a 1080p gamer, you can use dynamic resolution, but you'd only want to be dropping slightly below your set minimum frame rate, otherwise you will start to notice a big drop in sharpness. For most gamers though, I would recommend modifying the graphics settings to a level where you're getting around 45 to 50 FPS in the most intensive areas. Then you can use dynamic resolution to keep that above 60 FPS. And of course, you could do similar for high refresh gaming with a 90 FPS target if you have the GPU horsepower to do so. This is a great way to get bonus performance with a very minor hit to visuals. Of course, in some situations, as I mentioned, dynamic resolution can't do all the work. The RX 570, for example, isn't capable of smooth 60 FPS 1440p gameplay at ultra settings, even with dynamic resolution. So you'll have to mess around with the quality options, and that's what we'll be getting into now. The best part about the Gears 5 menu is it already gives you plenty of hints as to what each setting does. There's a full written description plus vague performance indicators for CPU, GPU, and VRAM, and even visual quality comparisons. The performance indicators aren't always great, as we'll get to in a moment, but the visual comparisons are spot on. I found similar differences to the provided images in the actual game world, so I'd highly recommend flicking through them in the game if you were tossing up between different settings, and I'll be showing them here because they're better than any footage I captured. We'll start here with the presets. Gears 5 has a decent scope for configuring visuals based on the level of hardware you have. There is lots of scope for giving great visuals on high-end systems, while also having the ability to tune things down on low-end hardware. Each of the 4 presets steps back every level of the game's presentation, from textures to object detail to shadows, reflections, tessellation, depth of field, and so on. I also feel that each preset steps back quality in an appropriate way. High doesn't look as good as Ultra in some situations, medium pares it back more, low is obviously designed for low-end systems with a particularly striking lack of texture quality and shadows. This isn't a game where stepping down from Ultra to High is basically a free performance switch. They do look similar in some areas, but I still think that overall Ultra does give the better presentation here. The performance gains you do see with each preset downgrade I also feel are quite appropriate. There's really no bad option here. If you need 25% more performance, you can drop from Ultra to High, but you'll be noticing, a sacrificing of shadow detail, tessellation, reflections, and texture clarity. Medium is a similar step down, and then low gives you more than double the performance of Ultra, which is what I like to see, but really this is only for entry-level systems given the quality downgrade. However, while the presets are a neat and easy way to improve performance, there are some settings that don't improve performance when you step down a quality level. So for many gamers, it's worth keeping them on Ultra. So let's find out which settings they are. For texture settings, we have 6 separate options, which is a surprise given many games typically bundle all texture options into one. For character, world, and effects texture detail, there isn't a huge difference between high and ultra, although it is noticeable at 4K. It's when you step down to medium that the differences become apparent, and there's quite a severe drop-off in texture clarity. Low is even worse, offering almost no texture detail. It's very soupy with these settings. Out of the 3 settings, there is only one that actually affects performance, and that's world texture detail. On a high-end card with 8GB of VRAM at 4K, tuning down from ultra to medium improved frame rates by around 2%. Not that I think it's worth it given the significant quality downgrade. On more mainstream cards like say an RX 570 with 4GB of VRAM at 1440p, I saw up to a 4% gain. Surprisingly, even with a limited 4GB frame buffer, the RX 570 showed no performance differences with the other texture settings, and even then, I don't think a 4% gain is enough to justify switching from ultra to medium. Unless you're on a low-end GPU, I'd keep this all the way up on ultra. Similar story for cone step mapping, a minor visual difference between the modes as you can see here, with no impact to performance. Less than a 1% improvement going from ultra to off, even on lower end hardware. Texture streaming is a setting that you also won't have to touch if you have a decent system, even with a mainstream GPU. I'd only mess around with this if you're playing the game off a slow storage device or have a low-end CPU that can't handle fast texture streaming. On the systems I tested with, an entry-level SATA SSD, keeping this on ultra was the best choice. Texture filtering is an interesting setting. For the most part, I couldn't distinguish the significant difference between the 16 times and 4 times anisotropic modes, even at 4K with ultra settings and in the actual game. It's only when dropping to 2x that the difference becomes apparent and texture quality gets reduced. In terms of performance, we're looking at a 2% improvement dropping from 16 times to 4 times and 4% going to 2 times. High-end gamers will probably keep this on 16 times for the best texture quality, but I could easily recommend dropping it down to 4x for mid-range gamers wanting a bit more performance. I wouldn't recommend the 2x setting unless on entry-level hardware. There are 4 detail options covering character detail, world detail, foliage detail, and animation quality. There are definite differences in visuals between the various modes. The higher you go, the better models you get, and for something like foliage, the more dense the foliage becomes. The good news is there is no performance difference between any of these settings, even on mainstream GPUs. At best, you'll see a 1% improvement moving from ultra to medium or low settings. I would keep all of these settings on ultra and set animation quality to auto as well. The next block of options is where things start to get really interesting. First up, we have dynamic shadow quality. There are 5 options here, including an insane mode that takes things up a notch from ultra. Each mode is a steady increase to the amount of shadowing, the accuracy of the shadowing, and the resolution. Low clearly disables most shadows for the best performance. Medium introduces basic shadowing. High and ultra become progressively more dense and sharp, while insane also seems to add contact shadows and a big improvement to shadow sharpness. This setting has the biggest visual difference of any in the game in my opinion, so it's no surprise the performance differs greatly between the highest and lowest options. The best option for you really depends on the hardware you have, but to me, I actually wouldn't bother with Ultra. If you have a powerful GPU and want the best visuals, I'd step it up to Insane to get those sweet contact shadows and the sharpest shadow presentation. It's a decent upgrade for a 4 to 5% performance hit compared to Ultra. But if you have a mid-range GPU and you're looking for extra performance without a huge loss to visuals, I'd push shadows down to high. You'll immediately gain 7% to your average frame rate, and while shadow density does drop off, it's a good trade-off if you need the frame rate and better than going all the way down to medium. Low-end gamers can get even more performance with medium, but to be honest, I wouldn't even consider the low setting unless you have turned every other setting down and still aren't hitting a good frame rate, because yeah, the game looks bad with low shadows. Capsule shadow quality is a different story. This affects the shadows on and around characters, including self-shadowing onto the character models. There isn't much of a visual difference until you switch this feature off entirely, where you'll see self-shadowing disabled. Given you'll get less than a 1% performance uplift switching capsule shadows off, I wouldn't bother and just keep this on Ultra. Ambient occlusion affects self-shadowing in the environment. Medium adds ambient occlusion for close objects, high improves the draw distance, and then ultra adds density and accuracy on top of that. Given in my testing there was less than a 1% difference between medium and ultra, There's no reason to use anything but Ultra here for mid-range gamers and above. If you're on a lower end system, turning ambient occlusion off will give you a decent 7% bump to frame rates, but at a cost of visuals, which is why my preference is to leave it enabled. Tessellation has a big impact on how ground surfaces, particularly snow, appear in the game. Turning this feature off makes the ground look flat and boring, while medium adds a decent amount of depth at a low resolution. High increases the quality, and Ultra takes things up a step further with better draw distances. Given that frame rates only increase by 1% or so when disabling tessellation compared to Ultra, I see no reason to use anything but Ultra here. This is a surprising result given the large visual differences between each mode, but even on mid-range AMD hardware, this just wasn't a big performance hog. Volumetric fog is one of those features that often has a significant performance difference between each of the settings, often for not much difference in visual quality. That's a little bit of the case here. I haven't been able to spot many differences between the 4 main modes while in the game, although switching the feature off entirely is noticeable, of course. To me, it's only dropping down to medium or low where the resolution downgrade for the effect becomes slightly noticeable. When looking at the performance data, it's clear to me that high is the optimal mode to use. Same performance as the less visually impressive options, and you'll gain around 1% to performance over Ultra. The insane mode seems a bit useless to me. The improvement over Ultra is next to nothing visually, but it tanks performance. Maybe this is just a stress test feature. Screen space reflections provides another significant difference in visuals between the 5 available modes. As you move from medium to high to Ultra to insane, the amount of surfaces that have reflections, the draw distance to which reflections are applied, and the quality of the reflections themselves all increase. The cadence from one setting to the next makes perfect sense. Off naturally removes screen space reflections entirely. While insane clearly looks the best, it's also very taxing, dropping performance by over 10% compared to Ultra. It looks nice, but that hit is too high to justify in my opinion. Those with high-end hardware should stick to Ultra. If you're running a mid-range GPU, I think high is a great choice here, as you'll gain an extra 1 to 2% to performance, and it still looks reasonable. Not quite as good as Ultra, but still decent. Low-end GPU owners should disable the feature for the extra 4 to 5% to performance. Refractions is a personal preference setting, as there is a visual difference, as you'll see here, but no performance difference. Choose whichever style you like and leave it at that. For post-process effects, we have a number of options that are largely personal preference settings as well. For example, bloom quality has basically no effect on performance unless you turn the effect completely off, which gains you less than 1% to frame rates. There is a visual difference between high and ultra and medium, but no performance difference. So yeah, pick a style that you like. Same with lens flares, although this time, there is no performance difference at all, whether you keep the feature enabled or disabled. Turning off light shafts will give you a 2% boost to performance, but again, no difference between the other settings. Subsurface scattering also has next to no performance impact, so is worth keeping enabled. The 2 post-process effects that do have a performance impact are depth of field and motion blur. The different depth of field options dictate the quality of the bokeh or background blur. Personally, I think Ultra looks the best here, but if you want a light version of the effect, step down to medium and you'll get a 1% performance boost. Crucially, disabling the feature entirely can give you up to a 6% performance improvement, which is great for mainstream or lower end systems. Motion blur is a simple on-off toggle with an intensity slider. I know lots of people don't like the effect. I think it looks fine in this game, but disabling it will give you a 1% performance improvement. So that's all the quality settings in detail. Obviously, there are lots of settings in this game, but a surprisingly large number have next to no performance impact, even on mainstream level graphics cards. Pretty much all of the texture and detail settings can be left on Ultra unless you have low-end hardware, and there's plenty of reason to do so given visuals are best on the highest setting. And I think this is crucial to know because Gears 5 loves to recommend which settings to use when you fire up the game. With an RX 570 in my test system, for example, it largely recommended high settings with a few mediums thrown into the mix. However, as you've seen throughout this video, most of these settings can be brought back up to Ultra, delivering better texture quality and better draw distances at nearly no performance cost. Here are my 3 hardware unboxed recommended presets for this game. If you have high-end hardware and you're hitting your performance goals, there are no easy free performance features in this game where you can turn stuff down and get big performance boosts for only slight visual downgrades. Ultra gives the best visuals, so you should use Ultra where possible. Switching down to high typically either reduces visuals and performance or just reduces visuals. The only exception to this is volumetric fog, where I'd use the high mode. I'd also try and use the insane dynamic shadow quality setting, as the step up from Ultra is significant even if it reduces performance. However, I'd steer clear of insane volumetric fog and screen space reflections. For mid-range and mainstream gamers that want to improve performance in an optimal way, I'd make a few adjustments. Texture filtering to 4x, dynamic shadows and screen space reflections to high, and depth of field to medium. Doing that and leaving everything else on ultra saw me improve my frame rate by 22% on an RX 570 compared to ultra settings, while looking better than the high settings that are recommended for this GPU. I could gain an extra 9% moving to the recommended settings, but this requires sacrificing one tier of visual quality from basically every setting, most of which is unnecessary from a performance perspective. Then for more entry-level systems, I'd start turning some features off to gain performance and slightly reducing some of the texture and detail options. Switching the things off that are listed here makes the biggest performance uplift without making the game look terrible. The other settings that you turn down will only give minor returns in most cases. I also want to point out again that dynamic resolution scaling is definitely worth using in most cases. In my opinion, it works best if you want 60 FPS gameplay, but in the worst cases you're hovering around 45 to 50 FPS. Set a minimum frame rate of 60 FPS and the game will slightly lower the resolution on the fly with an almost indistinguishable hit to visual quality. It's best at 4K or 1440p though. 1080p gamers might want to stick with quality setting changes to avoid making the game too blurry. Overall, this is a really great game on PC from both a visuals and optimization standpoint. The Coalition have done a magnificent job and really have set the standard for what other PC games should do, such as having dynamic resolution and a great settings menu. It's not perfect though, there's still a bit of work to be done on dynamic res, and the recommended performance settings aren't always optimal, but this is a game that really shines on ultra settings, and I can't wait to get back in and complete the campaign. That's it for this one. We'll be back at it again next week with a look at Borderlands 3, so subscribe for that and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Lots of effort goes into these sorts of videos, so if you appreciate all the hard work, consider buying our merch from store.hardwareunboxed.com or joining our Patreon page, links in the description. That's it. I'll catch you in the next one.